2 charges, 2 failures, 12 elite operators, the best demolition unit in the US military, and an 18-inch concrete wall that wouldn't go down. Then a 71-year-old man stood up from a bucket, rolled up his sleeves, and said 5 words that silenced every man on that range. "You're fighting the wall wrong." 14 minutes later, 1 improvised charge, no shaped explosives, no modern tech, just C4, Decord, and a technique from 1968, and that wall came down clean, 1 shot. If you believe experience should never be dismissed, type respect in the comments right now, because what this retired combat engineer did next changed an entire elite unit forever. His name was Edwin Pulaski, and most of the guys on that range didn't know who he was or why he was there. The base commander had invited him as part of a heritage outreach program, one of those feel-good initiatives where retired veterans come visit active units, shake some hands, get a plaque, eat lunch in the mess hall and go home feeling appreciated. Edwin had driven himself to Fort Liberty from a small town outside Fayetteville in a rusted-out 2004 Chevy Silverado with a cracked windshield and a bumper sticker so sun-bleached you couldn't read it anymore. He moved slowly, not because he was fragile, but because he was deliberate. Everything about him was deliberate. The way he parked, the way he tucked his shirt in, the way he shook the base commander's hand with 2 firm pumps and then released, no lingering, no performance. He had a face like old leather left out in the weather, deep lines around his eyes, a jaw that still held its shape beneath loose skin, and hands that looked like they'd been rebuilt from parts, knuckles swollen, fingertips scarred, 1 pinky that didn't quite close all the way. When he arrived at the demolition range that morning, the operators barely noticed him. A few nodded politely. 1 sergeant muttered something about babysitting. Edwin just found his bucket, sat down, and watched. The exercise was supposed to be straightforward. The unit was training on breaching techniques for hardened structures, the kind of reinforced concrete walls you'd find in fortified compounds overseas. The Corps of Engineers had built a series of target walls on the range, each one progressively thicker and more heavily reinforced with rebar and mesh. The first 3 walls had gone down without any problems. Standard-shaped charges, linear cutting charges, placed by the book, detonated clean. The 4th wall was the problem. It was 18 inches of steel-reinforced concrete with a double layer of rebar in a crosshatch pattern, poured over a mesh cage. It was specifically designed to simulate the kind of construction that had given operators real trouble in theatre. The first charge was a standard configuration, textbook placement based on the latest technical manual. The detonation was loud, impressive, threw debris 50 feet, and when the dust cleared the wall had a shallow crater in it and nothing more. The captain called for a reassessment. His demolition NCO, a staff sergeant named Harmon who had graduated top of his class at the engineer school, recalculated the charge weight, adjusted the standoff distance, and reconfigured the placement using a newer method that emphasized penetration over fragmentation. The second detonation was even louder. The wall cracked, it shuddered, and it held. 18 inches of concrete and a skeleton of rebar looked back at them, defiant and intact. That's when the murmuring started. The operators were frustrated, and frustration in elite units doesn't look like anger. It looks like silence and tight jaws and guys checking their watches. The captain pulled Harmon aside and they had a quiet conversation that involved a lot of hand gestures toward the wall and a lot of head shaking. The base liaison officer, a major who had been assigned to accompany Edwin for the day, walked over to the old man and started making apologetic small talk. "Sorry about this, Mr. Pulaski. Looks like they're having some technical difficulties. We can head to the mess if you'd like." Edwin didn't take his eyes off the wall. "What's the rebar pattern?" he asked. The major blinked. "Excuse me?" Edwin turned and looked at him with eyes that were pale blue and absolutely steady. "The rebar? What gauge? What spacing? And is it tied or welded at the intersections?" The major had no idea. He was a logistics officer. He smiled the way people smile at elderly relatives who ask questions about things that don't concern them anymore. "I'm not sure about those specifics, sir. That's really more of a question for the engineers." Edwin nodded slowly, looked back at the wall and said nothing else. 20 minutes passed. The team was reconfiguring for a 3rd attempt, this time planning to use a tandem charge, 2 sequential detonations designed to exploit the damage from the first blast. It was a sound approach, technically. It was also going to use up the last of their allocated explosives for the exercise, and if it failed, the wall wins. The captain was not happy. He was standing near the equipment trailer reviewing calculations on a tablet when Edwin walked over. Not shuffled, not hobbled, walked, straight-backed, unhurried, with the kind of economy of motion that only comes from decades of moving through places where wasted movement gets you killed. "Captain," Edwin said. His voice was low and even, like gravel settling. The captain looked up. He was respectful but clearly distracted. "Yes, sir. Mr. Pulaski, right? We'll have this sorted out shortly. Sorry for the delay in the demonstration." Edwin didn't acknowledge the apology. "Your standoff is wrong," he said, "and you're fighting the rebar instead of using it." The captain paused. Harmon, who was standing 3 feet away, turned around. "Sir," Harmon said, and the word carried just enough edge to communicate that he did not appreciate input from a visitor, especially one old enough to be his grandfather. Edwin looked at Harmon the way a surgeon looks at a first-year resident who just picked up the wrong instrument. Not with contempt, with patience that has been earned through 1,000 repetitions of watching people learn what he already knows. "You're placing your charges to blow through the wall. That's wrong for this construction. The rebar is acting as a tensile cage. You crack the concrete, the rebar flexes, absorbs the energy, holds everything together. You hit it harder. Same thing happens. You could double your charge and that wall would still be standing because you're working against the structural design instead of with it." Harmon's face went tight. He was a proud technician, top of his class, published a paper on advanced breaching techniques. And now a 71-year-old man in a faded shirt was telling him his approach was fundamentally wrong. "With all due respect, sir," Harmon said, "we're using the current doctrinal method. These are the latest shaped charge configurations based on years of research and operational data." Edwin let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "I used to blow walls like this one in Hugh City. February 1968. We didn't have shaped charges. We didn't have doctrinal methods. We had C4, det cord, and about 30 seconds before someone started shooting at us again, and every wall we hit came down on the first try." The captain and Harmon exchanged a look. Hugh City. The Battle of Hugh, during the Tet Offensive, was one of the most brutal urban combat engagements of the entire Vietnam War. House to house, wall to wall, Marines and Army engineers blasting through fortified structures under constant fire for nearly a month. If this old man had been a demolition specialist in Hugh City, he wasn't just experienced, he was a living textbook that predated every manual Harmon had ever read. The captain studied Edwin's face for a long moment. "What would you do differently?" he asked. Edwin didn't hesitate. He turned and pointed at the wall. "You see where your charge left that horizontal crack about 2/3 up? That's your gift. The concrete is already compromised along that line, but the rebar is holding it like stitches in a wound. You don't need to overpower it. You need to cut the stitches and let gravity do the rest." He walked, again, walked, not shuffled, over to the equipment table and looked at what they had left. Det cord, a partial roll, some C4 blocks, blasting caps, tape. He picked up a block of C4 and held it in his scarred hand like it was a bar of soap. "In Hugh, we called this a zipper charge. You pack a thin line of C4 along the existing fracture, you run det cord tight against the rebar, not over it, against it, direct contact, and you tamp the whole thing with whatever you've got. Mud, sandbags, wet concrete dust, doesn't matter. The blast doesn't go through the wall, it goes along the fracture line and severs the rebar at the weak point. The top third of the wall loses its support and comes down under its own weight. One shot." Harmon opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. The captain looked at the remaining materials, then back at Edwin. "Can you rig it?" he asked. Edwin was already rolling up his sleeves. What happened next became something those operators would talk about for the rest of their careers. Edwin Pulaski, 71 years old, moved along that wall like he was reading Braille. His fingers traced the crack, feeling the depth, the direction, the way it tapered at the edges. He worked with the C4 like it was clay, pressing it into the fracture line in a thin, precise ribbon no wider than his thumb. He used a knife to score the blocks, shaping them with a craftsman's touch that made the younger soldiers stop what they were doing and just watch. The det cord he ran with his fingers pressing it flush against the exposed rebar, where the previous blast had chipped away the concrete cover. Every 6 inches he taped it, not a millimetre of slack. The tamping he did with wet sand from a pile near the equipment trailer, packing it over the charge line by hand, pressing it firm with his palms, building a crude but effective containment layer that would direct the blast energy exactly where he wanted it. The entire rig took him 14 minutes. When he stepped back, it didn't look like much. A muddy stripe across the wall with a thin wire trailing out to the firing position. Compared to the sophisticated shaped charges the team had used, it looked primitive. It looked like something from another century. Because it was. Edwin walked back to the blast perimeter and handed the firing lead to the captain. "Your range, your call," he said. The captain looked at the lead, looked at the wall, and looked at this old man whose hands were now dusted with sand and C4 residue, whose breathing hadn't changed, whose pulse was probably 60 beats per minute like he'd just finished a cup of coffee instead of rigging a live demolition charge. "Clear the range," the captain said into his radio. The operators moved to covered positions. The safety officer confirmed the area. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. Fire. The detonation was different. It wasn't the thunderclap of the shaped charges. It was sharper, more focused. A crack that sounded less like an explosion and more like a bone breaking. And then, almost in slow motion, the top third of that 18-inch reinforced concrete wall leaned forward, separated cleanly along the fracture line where every piece of rebar had been severed simultaneously, and came down in a single massive slab that hit the ground so hard the operators felt it through their boots 40 meters away. Dust billowed up in a grey curtain. When it settled, the wall was gone, not cracked, not damaged, gone. A clean horizontal break, the remaining lower section standing like a shelf, the upper portion lying flat on the ground in front of it like a drawbridge that had been dropped by a giant's hand. One shot, exactly like he said. Nobody moved for about 5 seconds. Then Harmon said a word that doesn't belong in polite company, but it was said with pure, unfiltered awe. The operators behind the barriers started looking at each other with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching reverence. The captain stood at the firing position holding the spent clacker and staring at the demolished wall like it had just performed a magic trick in reverse. Edwin Pulaski was already walking back to his bucket. He sat down, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, and started wiping the sand off his hands. The base commander, who had been watching from an observation vehicle, was already on his radio. Within 10 minutes, 3 senior officers arrived at the range, including a colonel from the engineer school who had been on base for a conference. They stood in front of the demolished wall and listened as the captain explained what had happened. The colonel turned and looked at Edwin across the range. Then he walked over, not at a stroll, at a pace that said, "This matters." "Mr. Pulaski," the colonel said. Edwin stood up. Old habits. "I'm Colonel Richardson. I run the advanced demolition curriculum at the engineer school." Edwin nodded. "I know who you are, sir. I've read your name on some of the updated manuals." The colonel's jaw tightened slightly, the way a man's jaw tightens when he realizes he's standing in front of someone whose experience makes his own career look like a footnote. "Mr. Pulaski, the technique you just demonstrated, the zipper charge with linear tamping along a pre-existing fracture, that's not in any current manual," Edwin almost smiled. "Almost. No, sir, it wouldn't be. We never wrote it down, didn't have time, we were too busy using it." What followed over the next hour was something none of the operators expected. Colonel Richardson called the engineer school and had them pull Edwin Pulaski's service record. What came back made the colonel sit down on the tailgate of a Humvee and read it twice. Edwin Pulaski had enlisted in 1965 at age 18. He trained as a combat engineer and volunteered for demolition specialist duty. He deployed to Vietnam in 1967 and was assigned to a unit that supported Marine infantry operations in the E Corps, the northernmost military region of South Vietnam. When the Tet Offensive hit in January 1968, his unit was thrown into the Battle of Hue, where they spent 26 days blowing holes through walls, collapsing fortified positions, and clearing paths through a city that had been turned into a fortress. Edwin personally rigged and detonated over 200 demolition charges during that battle alone. He was wounded 3 times, shrapnel in his left shoulder, a bullet through his right calf, and a concussion from a short round that put him down for 2 days before he got back up and went right back to the walls. He received the Silver Star for exposing himself to direct enemy fire to rig a charge on a fortified machine gun position that had pinned down an entire platoon. He received the Bronze Star with Valor device for rigging demolition charges on a bridge under sniper fire to prevent enemy reinforcement of a key position. He received 2 Purple Hearts. After Vietnam, he served another 14 years, deploying to various assignments, training countless engineers, and developing improvised breaching techniques that were used operationally for years, but were never formally codified because the institutional knowledge lived in the men, not in the manuals. He retired as a sergeant first class in 1986 and went home to North Carolina, where he worked as a building contractor until his knees gave out, and then he mostly stayed home, tended his garden, and didn't talk much about any of it. Colonel Richardson walked back to Edwin with the service record printed out and held it at his side like it weighed 50 pounds. "Sergeant First Class Pulaski," he said, using the rank deliberately. Edwin's eyes changed, not dramatically, just a flicker, the way a light comes on in a window of a house you thought was empty. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" the colonel asked. Edwin looked at him like the question didn't make sense. "You invited me to watch a demonstration, Colonel. That's what I was doing. You sat on that bucket for 2 hours watching us fail and didn't say a word." Edwin folded his handkerchief and put it back in his pocket. "Wasn't my place. Your men were working the problem. That's what good soldiers do. I only spoke up because they were about to waste their last charges on the same approach that already failed twice, and I've seen too many good men run out of explosives at the wrong moment to sit quiet through a third." The colonel was quiet for a long time. Then he did something that made every operator on that range stop what they were doing and watch. He came to attention. Full, rigid, textbook attention, and he saluted. A full-bird colonel saluting a retired enlisted man on an active demolition range, not because regulations required it, but because some things are owed regardless of rank, and this was one of them. Edwin returned the salute crisply, instinctively, the muscle memory of 30 years in uniform snapping his hand into place like he'd never taken the uniform off. Harmon was the next one to walk over. He didn't salute. He extended his hand. "Sergeant Pulaski," he said, and his voice had none of the edge it carried before. It was flat and honest and slightly rough, the way a man's voice gets when he's swallowing something that tastes like humility. "I owe you an apology. I dismissed you, and I was wrong." Edwin shook his hand. "You weren't wrong to trust your training, son. You were wrong to think training is the whole picture. The manual is the starting line. Everything after that, you earn with your hands and your time." Harmon nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. Colonel Richardson formally invited Edwin to the engineer school as a guest instructor. Not a ceremonial visit, not a plaque and handshake afternoon. A working role, 3 days a week, where Edwin sat with advanced demolition students and taught them techniques that existed nowhere in any current field manual. He taught them the zipper charge. He taught them how to read a structure by touch, how to feel for stress fractures, how to calculate blast direction using nothing but observation and experience. He taught them how to improvise with limited materials, because in combat you never have everything you need, and the man who can build a solution from what's available is the man who brings his people home alive. The students called him Sergeant P. Within a month, that name carried more weight in the hallways of the engineer school than half the instructors with advanced degrees, not because Edwin was louder or more commanding than anyone else, because he was quieter, because he answered questions with stories that had the smell of cordite and the weight of real consequence behind them. Because when he showed you how to place a charge, his hands moved with a certainty that no classroom could manufacture. Because he had done everything he was teaching, not in a laboratory, not in a simulation, but in a city that was burning while men tried to kill him, and he had done it over and over until the knowledge was in his bones. The captain from that first day on the range requested Edwin specifically for a follow-up training evolution with his unit. This time, Edwin didn't sit on a bucket. He stood at the front and walked them through 3 different improvised breaching methods, each one adapted from techniques he'd developed or refined during actual combat operations spanning 2 decades. At the end of the session, the captain gathered his team and told them something that none of them forgot. "Every one of us in this unit has spent years training with the best equipment and the latest technology. And today, a 71-year-old retired sergeant first class outperformed all of it with 50-year-old techniques and a roll of DT cord. That should tell you something. Technology is a tool, experience is a weapon, and respect is something you give to every person who walks onto your range, regardless of what they look like, how old they are, or how they got there, because you never know who's standing in front of you." Edwin continued at the engineer school for 7 months before his health made the drive too difficult. On his last day, the students and permanent staff held a formation in his honour. Colonel Richardson presented him with the school's Distinguished Instructor Award, a recognition normally reserved for active duty faculty with years of tenure. Edwin accepted it with a handshake and a nod. No speech. He wasn't a speech man. But as he walked to his truck afterward, Harmon was waiting by the driver's door. He had something in his hand. It was a framed photograph of the demolished wall from that first day on the range, the clean horizontal break, the slab lying flat, the dust still hanging in the air. On the back, every operator from the unit had signed it. At the bottom, in Harmon's handwriting, it said, "One shot. SFC Pulaski's wall." Edwin looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Harmon and said, "You're a good engineer, son. You'll be better now." He put the photo on his passenger seat, started his truck and drove home. The bumper sticker on the back of his Silverado, the one too sun-bleached to read from a distance, said one thing. It said, "Combat Engineer. First in, last out." He had never mentioned it. He never needed to. The wall spoke for him, the way walls had always spoken for men like Edwin Pulaski, by falling exactly when and where they were told to fall, because the man who placed the charge knew what he was doing, had always known what he was doing, and simply waited for someone to ask. If you believe that the experience of our veterans deserves respect, not just on holidays but every single day, subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and the next time you see an old man sitting quietly on a bucket watching, remember Edwin Pulaski. Remember that silence is not ignorance, stillness is not weakness, and the oldest hands in the room might just be the ones that know exactly how to bring down the wall.